Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. 10 days after British billionaire Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Galactic, made his first trip into space, Bezos, the world's wealthiest man, landed safely back on Earth on Tuesday after a successful launch by his private spaceflight company, Blue Origin. Another company, Elon Musk's SpaceX, seems focused on more distant travels like delivering cargo to the moon, Mars, and beyond. Its Crew Dragon spacecraft carrying 4 astronauts arrived at the International Space Station in April. As the billionaire space race heats up, commercial space tourism is officially taking off. With excitement over anticipated surge in demand for space travel, the sky seems no longer the limit. But will it be a game only for the rich? What's the limit for exploration in the final frontier? For more, let's loop in our panelists. For more, in Washington, D.C., Dr. Amitabh Ghosh, chair of the Science Operations Working Group for NASA Mars Exploration Rover mission. In Reston, Keith Cowan, a former NASA rocket scientist and an editor of NASAWatch.com. In Beijing, Zhang Fan, associate professor of astronomy from Beijing Normal University. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see you. I know it's been quite an exciting 24 hours for many of you, but let me start by asking, how do you see the latest achievement by Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos in terms of making space travel commercially possible? Dr. Ghosh, go to you first.
So it's a very fascinating day today. People have been going to the space station, which is 250 miles away, for 30 years. They stayed in space for 3 minutes. So what is so special about this? What is so special is they're trying to create a market in space. You are witnessing the fledgling birth of a new industry.
Yeah.
It is absolutely fascinating. This is what, the early days of aviation looked like. Nobody wanted to fly. It was so dangerous to fly. It was so expensive to fly. And then why would you want to fly to another continent in 10 hours? So a lot of it looks uncannily similar. It is that these 2 billionaires who are also businessmen, they're trying to create a mass market in space, where the mainstream people, not the governments, not the billionaires, but the mainstream people can actually go and enjoy space, and that becomes kind of a new normal in 10 years.
Well, it seems that the price tag is still a little bit high for, just for common folks. Mr. Cowan, 28 million, that's likely to be the price tag according to the latest news conference of Blue Origin. But what do you make of the significance of, commercial space travel?
Well, that 28 million, this was a special first time they raffled a ticket off to raise money. And of that 28 million, 19 million was given to a variety of educational organizations. Right. The going rate for Blue Origin or for Virgin Galactic is around $250,000. It's still quite a bit of money. And over time, the thought is that they have 100 million already taken in by Blue Origin, and close to that from Virgin Galactic. The idea being that you fly these rich folks off, and that as the market starts to expand, you add more vehicles, and the customer base grows. And at some point, competition really starts to act where somebody finds a cheaper way to do this or to offer another service, and then suddenly somebody said, I can do that flight without the champagne and with one flight attendant. And then suddenly, pure commercial factors came into it. Yeah. Now we fly and we complain about not enough legroom.
Well, certainly we see one after another billionaires trying to invest into this commercial outer space travel business. But if you look at the division of labor, it seems quite interesting, isn't it? Branson, Bezos, and also, of course, Musk, they each have chosen a different territory, it seems, and also different groups of partners as well. Tell me more about that, Mr. Cowan. I know you've been covering NASA-related news. Tell me more about your observation.
Well, they're all similar and they're all different simultaneously. Yeah. They overlap. with Blue Origin, they're looking to build a big rocket, and eventually they would like to land things on the moon and go to places outside the low Earth orbit. SpaceX is already doing that. They have contracts with NASA to take cargo to the International Space Station and to cruise, and they are now, with their own money, building a monstrous rocket called Starship, which is larger than anything that has ever flown.
Right.
And it seeks to drop the cost dramatically to put things into space. And in the middle, you have Virgin Galactic, which is purely into tourism. That's all they really want to do, although they did spin off some of their technology to launch small satellites, which they did just last week. So it depends, as they say, where, do you want to fly into space for a few minutes, or do you want to go and stay for a while? And, you know, the pricing, again, it's like, do you just want people to give their own money? Do you want to get government contracts? It's a mixture. But somewhere, as you mentioned, they have different audiences. But there's always this overlap because they may try and encroach on each other's territory at some point as the competition factor starts to set in.
I'm sure the market will decide, right? But if you think about it,
Yes.
Dr. Ghosh, their cooperation with NASA and other space agencies that are mainly supported by the states, it's a very interesting approach, isn't it? How do you see that?
I think the vision of NASA, perhaps, to give that push to the private sector so that the private sector can go and find a market which is non-government. So I think that is exactly what is happening. So there is other NASA technology which NASA funds, and then they have become offshoots, and they have found a different market, different from the government. So you can say that that is one of perhaps what NASA tries to do as well. So it fits in with their mandate as well.
Professor Jiang Fan, you've been tentatively listening to your colleagues earlier. Because earlier there were initial development of commercial flights for outer space, also from the Chinese side. What is the latest development?
So it's a bit complicated. So the small startup companies that does rockets in China, there are a few of them like Link, iSpace, Blue Arrow. They're a lot smaller. They can do rockets that hover and they can land. So they're more on par with what Blue Origin, New Shepard does, but to a lesser extent because their engines are not hydrogen, oxygen. Hydrogen is extremely difficult to work with. They're now racing to try to reach orbit and then come back down again. So there is a vibrant sector in China, but they're generally lagging behind what the US counterparts do. The difference with Chinese situation is that Chinese state sector for the space administration does a lot more than NASA. Its companies, the state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises, they are majority state-owned, but they're also partly privately owned. They're listed on the stock market, so they have a lot of extensive, more commercial enterprises. So a lot of the things that this company is trying to do are being tested out by the state sector in China. And also, in addition to just launching rockets, there are a lot of space utilization things that Chinese companies looking into. For example, manufacturing, medical research. And because the Chinese state sector tends to be concentrating on space infrastructure quite a bit. So I think the possibility for the Chinese niche is not to compete on building more of those similar rockets, but instead to group together leading industry experts on different things and then having the state sector serve their needs. That's another route for doing it.
You know, there have been a long discussion, even in the US, about whether it is possible for commercial space exploration. And now it seems that both technology, governance, and other factors point to the right direction. So tell me more, Mr. Cowing, about this debate going on in the US. How do you see this process? And why do we see, quote unquote, an explosion of possibilities now?
Well, why do we see it? It's pretty much organic, and the fact that these things all happen together. it may be coincidence, it may be serendipity. When you have capitalism at work, sometimes it's a mysterious force nobody understands, but it happens. But when it does, and you take notice of it, you harness those forces. Now, one of the things that SpaceX, with its Starship, is actually capable of doing is they not only do they have the funding of a medium-sized nation space program, Elon Musk will have a vehicle that is capable of going to orbit the moon and land on it. Indeed, his proposal for the initial American lander on the moon is a Starship. But it's also the same vehicle that could do a suborbital ballistic hop across half the world. He just changes the engines around and hits the software and it does its thing. So is he doing exploration? He can, but he can also do other things. Whereas with NASA, with like the SLS, that rocket has one purpose, and that's to do exploration with a big program. It doesn't have any commercial use whatsoever. So I think that's the market difference with the private sector is all of their products can do more than one thing, and they're thinking evolutionarily and synergistically and how to do forward and backward compatibility, all the things you see in consumer products, which isn't a coincidence because the three companies have consumer base as their genesis to begin with.
On the other hand, a safety issue is a big one. Earlier, we have seen SpaceX one after another, zigzagging road to success. Meanwhile, we also know Blue Origin, in order to cut the price of the outer space travel, they have almost what some call an amusement park version of what is necessary, for example, with the rocket and many other things. So how do you look at also the test to the limits of safety with all the latest commercial explorations?
That is more an engineering strategy. And I think if you think of Blue Origin and SpaceX, they have had their development go hand in hand with safety concerns, and they have addressed it because so for example, SpaceX, they have developed something with NASA, and so of course they have to ensure safety. So it has to be built into that engineering program. Otherwise, if that guideline, the safety guidelines and requirements are not met, then they would not be allowed to fly.
Mr. Gowing, your take?
In terms of safety, you can't guarantee it. You can get closer and closer to it. It's asymptotic. And at some point you accept the risk that's acceptable because nothing's perfect. Again, they say the only way to be perfectly safe is not to fly. I've had the training to fly in Virgin Galactic, which in the centrifuge, I pulled 6.2 Gs and all that. It's a much more rigorous thing than any, quote, amusement park. And I understand the analogy. So these vehicles are pushing the limit of what a consumer can buy and use in the States. All right. But at some point, it's sort of the sanity test, like Mr. Bezos went in that because he's a bit of a risk taker, but his people told him that it's an acceptable risk. And that's what you get when you start going into this sort of maybe expensive adventure sport, whether it's, I lived at Everest Base Camp for a month with 1,000 people going to climb Everest around me. You write off a piece of paper and say, I'm going to spend all my money, and there's a certain risk that goes with that. But, you have to have a system that's capable of delivering that level of risk that you've accepted. Right. And that's, I think, where the magic comes. You have to test it until it breaks, which is what Elon Musk is doing. And if indeed you go to YouTube, you can see a blooper reel of all the rockets he blew up, because that's how you get there. Right.
Another thing, how are we going to see the outer space is going to be governed? I mean, it sounds like a very political issue, but it's not, because with more, commercial flights into the outer space, people traveling there, it is very much an issue. How people, countries, companies correlate with one another, what is going to be the rule of law, quote unquote, in the outer space, and how are they going to guarantee the safety of everyone? So, Dr. Zhang, tell me more about your thoughts on the latest development as you know it.
Yeah, I think this is really important question because space is by definition international, because the orbit, the way the orbit works, you can't stay just over the top of one nation. It has to be, and you mentioned safety. It's this in space. It's not just safety for themselves, for the astronauts. It's also for other people. For not just safety, but also annoyance. For example, you can say that SpaceX Starlink is destroying astronomy because they're launching so many thousands of little satellites in low Earth orbit that you can't see through them into the space anymore, and they're beaming radio waves and destroying radio astronomy. And also in the future, there are even more dangerous things. For example, Blue Origin is thinking about space mining, and if they drag an asteroid into Earth's orbit, you really don't want that thing to deorbit and hit Earth. So this kind of things, you need a regulation and you need enforcement, international enforcement. It has to come from, the best I can think of is through strengthening UN into some law enforcement capabilities when it comes to space. But otherwise, I mean, if I'm a company, if you have strong laws, I would just go to an island nation without strong laws, right? But then that's kind of a global governance is really gonna annoy a lot of people on the right of the political spectrum.
Right.
So education, at least to tell people why is this important.
I
will be the
see.
beginning.
Awareness. Mr. Cowen.
One, yeah, I'm sure countries in the equatorial region are probably looking at becoming, their own little, duty-free spaceports. But in terms of governance, one of the things that the U.S. did a couple of years back is something that seems to have sprung forth from a lot of these collaborative treaties that have come before, and they call it the Artemis Accords, which the U.S. started. And I know there was some discussion as to whether it's imposing rules or bringing rules of behavior in, and I think they settled at a low level of accepted norms. And I think it's a dozen or so countries have signed now. Unfortunately, it's sort of seen as an America-centric effort, and I know China and Russia said, no, we're gonna do it our way. And probably the similarity is very great, but there's the geopolitical stuff that we have to deal with right now. But that said, there is a hopeful sign. If you look at the International Space Station, and I worked on this back in the 90s, and when they said, well, we're going to bring the Russians in, it was, oh my God, we're all going to die. Well, here we are 20-something years later, and other than really small, almost insignificant incidents, it's been very peaceful up there. And if you read the newspapers, the US and Russia aren't agreeing on a lot of things right now. So you got to ask yourself, why is it that we misbehave on Earth, but up in space, it seems to be very well behaved? There might be something special. It's maybe not something in the air or lack thereof. But there is something about working up there, pun intended. There is something about working up there that seems to just people back off a bit and say, this is a little more important than this, what I want or what you have. And it's working. It's working on the International Space Station. China's space station's up there now. And I'm going to be fascinated to see how two large space stations with overlapping and compatible technology start to, swap stuff back and forth.
For now, thank you, the three of you, for joining us. Keith Gowing, Amitabh Ghosh, Zhang Fan. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.